Good evening and welcome to the February 3rd, 2022 Fireside Chat with LaRouche. And our topic tonight is in honor not of Black History Month, but of Bleak History Month. There's a personage that haunts the various perplexing circumstances that the world finds itself in, whether we're talking about the war that is not a war in Ukraine, or we're talking about the coronavirus that just won't go away despite the fact that people want to go back to normal, or we're talking about the impending collapse of the everything monetary financial bubble, and the fact that the thing called the transatlantic economy is about to vaporize, despite the fact that people believe the opposite to be true. The reason for these mistakes is not simply a kind of monumental stupidity on the part of the transatlantic elites. There is an element of that, but it comes from a set of axioms concerning the world post-1945 and the way in which those axioms were imposed on the world through British intelligence and the British Empire's cultural impact on the United States in particular, which was the world's leading nation coming out of the Second World War, and therefore the world as a whole. And I'm going to let our speaker give you the reasons that we're calling this Happy Bertrand Russell Goes to Hell Day. But I will read to you from an essay that Bertrand Russell wrote back in 1945. I should say that he lived for about almost 100 years, almost a century, from approximately 1868 or thereabouts until about 1967, I believe it was, when he died. And therefore, as he himself said, he straddled the period between the time of the rule of the British Empire over the entire world to watching whole empires vanish as if into the morning mist, that he felt very uncomfortable in a world that was run by the United States. I'm reading to you from something that appeared in the Atomic Scientist Bulletin, and there was an introduction to this article, which will and I'm reading, you'll see why, because it indicates that America had a different view of things that were British back at that time. The introduction says, Mr. Russell is transmitting this manuscript to us, which has an interesting tale, indicating that it had been refused by 5 American periodicals of wide circulation. In offering it to the Bulletin, which he reads with, quote, interest and attention, Mr. Russell trusted us to cut it if necessary without distorting his views. We published the article in full in the belief that Mr. Russell automatically deserves an American audience and that the Bulletin reader is sufficiently discriminating to profit from articles which he does not necessarily endorse. So this thing, as you heard, was rejected by 5 different American publications, but was then put in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And I just want to indicate by reading one paragraph why Bertrand Russell is necessary to understand, and why we would bring that to you tonight in the middle of the Ukraine crisis, in the middle of coronavirus, in the middle of a meltdown of the Biden administration, and in the middle of economic and financial dislocation, both in the United States and worldwide. Why would we want to talk about him? He says here in a section called The Permanent Prevention of War. Remember, this is 1945-46. He says, it is entirely clear that there is only one way in which great wars can be permanently prevented, and that is the establishment of an international government with a monopoly of serious armed force. When I speak of an international government, I mean one that really governs, not an amiable facade like the League of Nations or a pretentious sham like the United Nations under its present constitution. An international government, if it is to be able to preserve peace, must have the only atomic bombs the only plants for producing them, the only air force, the only battleships, and generally whatever is necessary to make it irresistible. Its atomic staff, its air squadrons, the crews of its battleships, and its infantry regiments must each severally be composed of men of many different nations. There must be no possibility of the development of national feeling in any unit larger than a company. Every member of the international armed force should be carefully trained in loyalty to the international government. The international authority must have a monopoly of uranium and of whatever other raw materials may hereafter be found suitable for the manufacture of atomic bombs. It must have a large army of inspectors who must have the right to enter any factory without notice. Any attempt to interfere with them or to obstruct their work must be treated as a casus belli. They must be provided with, and it goes on and so on, airplanes enabling them to discover whether secret plants are being established, and so forth, and says the monopoly of armed force is the most necessary attribute of the international government. Now, there are other things we're about to hear about this, but what's relevant about this to read to you now is when you look at the issue of the expansion of NATO over against the actual circumstance that we find ourselves in as we speak here tonight. And you look at the fact that a manufactured conflict with the world's other leading nuclear power, Russia, has been perpetrated as a hoax upon the American people, intent upon precipitating an actual war which could go nuclear. Then you can see how a kind of madness was released upon the world decades ago, almost a century ago, by this character. And matter of fact, a little bit later in the program, we'll read to you from a document that he wrote back in 1924, which is actually 98 years ago, which you'll hear from the quotations how unfortunately contemporary it is. So to give the presentation and tell you a lot more about this, we have Anastasia Battle, who's with us, and here we go.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for having me on. I wanted to have this meeting today because Bertrand Russell, he died yesterday. He died February 2nd. And it's really important that we look at this person. I don't know if you would really want to call him a man, but look at this person and look at what he had done throughout the last 100 years and on, and how that's affected the thinking in the United States and internationally, and why Mr. LaRouche would call this man the most evil man of the 20th century. And we actually, in Seattle, when I was organizing in Seattle, we took a book table to the University of Washington, and we had posters up on February 2nd that said, "Happy Bertrand Russell Goes to Hell Day." If you saw our invitation, you actually would have seen those posters that we had a few years ago. And we got such a response to this, which was a little surprising, right? You wouldn't think like, everybody knows about Bertrand Russell. Da, 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 da. The philosophy department was flipping out, coming up to us, yelling at us about how we're taking everything he's saying out of context, we're not really talking about the truth, and they even tried to steal our posters. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. And we were actually reading, they were saying, these quotes were taken out of context. We actually pulled out the full quote of what this guy was saying, similar to what Dennis just read, and reading it out to them, and it was really getting under people's skin. But it's really important because you imagine, as a student, you're going about the world, you're thinking about things, and you keep getting stuck in these cycles of repetitive thoughts, and you don't really understand why that's happening. You know they're wrong, but you don't really know why you keep thinking them. Sometimes they're emotional, sometimes they're intellectual, and you just feel stuck, right? This also comes up when people look at our political leaders. You're like, God, why are they so stupid? Why do they keep doing all these stupid things over and over and over again? So understanding Bertrand Russell and communicating what he actually did, what his intentions were, and how he did it is actually very important. And I want to just read to you another quote from Bertrand Russell. It's from his 1951 book, The Impact of Science on Society. He says, physiology and psychology afford fields for scientific technique which still await development. Two great men, Pavlov and Freud, have laid the foundation. I do not accept the view that they are in any essential conflict. But what structure will be built on their foundations is still in doubt. I think the subject will be of most importance politically is mass psychology. Its importance has been enormously increased by the growth of modern methods of propaganda. Of these, the most influential is what is called education. Religion plays a part, though a diminishing one. The press, the cinema, and the radio play an increasing part. It may be hoped that in time, anybody will be able to persuade anybody of anything if he can catch the patient young and is provided by the state with money and equipment. He continues, the subject will make great strides when it is taken up by scientists under a scientific dictatorship. A social psychologist of the future will have a number of classes of school children to whom they will try different methods of producing an unshakable conviction that snow is black. Various results will soon be arrived at. First, that the influence of home is obstructive. Second, that not much can be done unless indoctrination begins before the age of 10. Third, that versus set of music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. Fourth, that the opinion that snow is white must be held to show a morbid taste for eccentricity. But I anticipate it is for future scientists to make these maxims precise and discover exactly how much it costs per head to make children believe that snow is black, and how much less it would cost to make them believe it is a dark gray. So think about that. Think about what's been going on in the world, what's been going on in the United States, perhaps even in your own organizing, why people say things that just seem so crazy and unfounded in any way, but they say it with so much conviction that they are emotionally attached to it. How did that happen? I want to bring up, just kind of to emphasize this point, which I'm sure some of you may not even believe it, that we actually have a leader in our government who's this insane. But I want to read from U.S. Senator Roger Wicker, or as we like to call him, the Wicker Man. He said on December 7th, which, by the way, he's a ranking Senate Armed Services Committee member. He says, this is in regards to Ukraine, military action could mean that we stand off with our ships in the Black Sea and we rain destruction on Russian military capability. It could mean that we participate, and I would not rule that out. I would not rule out American troops on the ground. We don't rule out first-use nuclear action. Let that sink in for a minute. So this is not about taking a political side, right? Because obviously both of the parties are nuts. But looking at what's causing them to be this crazy, what's causing our own population to be essentially worse than impotent, really. I mean, you've got people who actually believe that Bertrand Russell is this great peacekeeper, but from what Dennis just read, he was a proponent of an international government and having ultimate control over all nuclear weapons and pushing it and controlling other nations. What kind of peacenik is that? He never apologized for that. And so when you think about all these lines about how great Bertrand Russell is or this and that, I mean, even my own relatives on my husband's side praise this guy. You start to kind of piece some things together when you look at the peace movement itself. Right? We got a peace movement which is worse than impotent. We have people that are not actually taking action to do anything. In fact, you have people that are supposedly, right, peaceful people in our own government who are creating a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan of biblical proportions over a made-up humanitarian issue. I mean, how insane is that? We're literally pushing famine in Afghanistan. 23 million people are about to starve to death over a made-up humanitarian issue. So I want people to think about, we brought up a few things, in the past, or I've been on this program before, but just what does it actually mean to have an education? What does this really mean? Because it's not acquiring information. It's not being perfectly logical. I mean, you could say that Senator Wicker is, quote unquote logical. Yes, we could in fact rain down weapons on Russia and probably, annihilate them. But of course, we all know that would mean the annihilation of the human race. But how do we actually educate our children? What is the thinking process in even doing that anymore? And I really think that's the key in this question, because if we can understand how the human mind works, how making a discovery works, this is not about having the right answer, but the process in which you come to that truthful answer. That's actually what's the most important. Because if you can understand that process, then you cannot be dissuaded from truth. You can have a discussion to figure out if there's more to something, but once you understand when something is truthful, that can't be taken away from you. That's a certain power that you now possess. So I want to take another quote here from Bertrand Russell, just to kind of underline some of this stuff, because, like I was saying, he's praised as this, great peacekeeper, but then he's also talking about, world domination and pushing these kinds of things. I'm going to take another quote from his 1951 Impact of Science on Society, where he says, "At present, the population of the world is increasing at about 58,000 per diem. War so far has had no very great effect on the increase, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove effective. If a Black Death could spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be unpleasant, but what of it?" I'll take another one here from his book called Icarus. Just to kind of, it's really want to underline what his intention is. He says, "Birth control is a matter of great importance, particularly in relation to the possibility of a world government. which could hardly be stable if some nations increase their population much more rapidly than others. At present, birth control is increasing in all civilized countries, though in most it is opposed by governments. The opposition is due partly to mere superstition and desire to consolate the Catholic vote, partly to the desire for large armies and severe competition between wage earners, so as to keep down wages. In spite of the opposition of governments, it seems probable that birth control will lead to a stationary population in most white nations within the next 50 years. There can be no security that it will stop with a stationary population. It may go on to the point where the population diminishes. The increase in the practice of birth control is an example of a process contrary to that seen in industrialism. It represents a victory of individual over the collective passions. Collectively, Frenchmen desire that France should be populous in order to be able to defeat her enemies in war. Individually, they desire that their own family should be small in order to increase the inheritance of their children and to diminish the expense of education. The individual desire has triumphed over the collective desire, and even in many cases, over religious scruples. In this case, as in most others, the individual desire is less harmful to the world than the collective desire. The man who acts from pure selfishness does less damage than the man who actuated by public spirit. For since medicine and sanitation have diminished the infant death rate, the only checks to overpopulation that remain, apart from birth control, are war and famine. So long as this continues to be the case, the world must either have a nearly stationary population or employ war to produce famine. The latter method, which is that favored by the opponents of birth control, has been adopted on a large scale since 1914. It is, however, somewhat wasteful. We require a certain number of cattle and sheep, and we take steps to secure the right number. If we were as indifferent about them as we are about human beings, we should produce far too many and cause the scrupulous to die by the slow misery of underfeeding. Farmers would consider this plan extravagant, and humanitarians would consider it cruel. But where human beings are concerned, it is considered the only proper course, and works advocating any other are confiscated by the police if they are intelligible to those whom they concern. It must be admitted, however, that there are certain dangers. Before long, the population may actually diminish. This is already happening in the most intelligent sections of the most intelligent nations. Government opposition to birth control propaganda gives a biological advantage to stupidity, since it is chiefly stupid people who governments succeed in keeping in ignorance. Before long, birth control may become nearly universal among white races. It will then not deteriorate their quality, but only diminish their numbers. At a time when uncivilized races are still prolific and are preserved from high death rate by white science. This situation will lead to a tenacity, already shown by the French, to employ more prolific races as mercenaries. Governments will oppose the teaching of birth control among Africans for fear of losing recruits. The result will be an immense numerical inferiority of the white races, leading probably to their extermination in a mutiny of mercenaries. If, however, a world government is established, it may see the desirability of making subject races less prolific, and may permit mankind to solve the population question, This is another reason for desiring a world to quality of population. We come to the question of eugenics. We may perhaps assume that if people grow less superstitious, governments will acquire the right to sterilize parents. This power will be used at first to diminish imbecility, a most desirable object. But probably in time, opposition to the government will be taken to prove imbecility so that rebels of all kinds will be sterilized. Apoplectics, consumptives, dipsemantics, and so on will gradually be included. In the end, there will be a tendency to include all who failed to pass the usual school examinations. The result will be to increase the average intelligence. In the long run, it may be greatly increased, but probably the effect upon really exceptional intelligence will be bad. Mr. Micawber, who was Dickens' father, would hardly have been regarded as a desirable parent. How many imbeciles ought to outweigh one Dickens? I do not profess to know. Eugenics has, of course, more ambitious possibilities in a more distant future. It may aim not only at eliminating undesired types, but at increasing desired types. Moral standards may alter so as to make it possible for one man to be the sire of a vast progeny of many different mothers. When men of science envisage a possibility of this kind, they are prone to a type of fallacy which is common also in other directions. They imagine that a reform inaugurated by men of science would be administered as men of science would wish, by men similar in outlook to those who have advocated it. In like manner, women who advocated votes for women used to imagine that the woman voter of the future would resemble that ardent feminist who won her the vote. And socialist leaders imagined that a socialist state would be administered by idealistic reformers like themselves. These are, of course, delusions. A reform, once achieved, is handed over to the average citizen. So, if eugenics reached the point where it could increase desired types, it would not be the types desired by present-day eugenicists that would be increased, but rather the type desired by the average official. Prime ministers, bishops, and other whom the state considered desirable might become the fathers of half the next generation. Whether this would be an improvement, it is not for me to say, as I have no hope to ever become either a bishop or a minister. And we got a little bit more. The effects of psychology on practical life may in time become very great. Already, advertisers in America employ eminent psychologists to instruct them in the technique of producing irrational belief. Such men may, when they have grown more proficient, be very useful in persuading the democracy that governments are wise and good. Then again, there are the psychological tests of intelligence, as applied to recruits for the American Army during the war. I am very skeptical of the possibility of testing anything except average intelligence by such methods. And I think that if they were widely adopted, they would probably lead to many persons of great artistic capacity being classified as morons. The same thing would have happened to some first-rate mathematicians. Specialized ability not infrequently goes with general disability, but this would not be shown by the kinds of tests which psychologists recommend to the American government. More sensational than tests of intelligence is the possibility of controlling the emotional life through the secretions of the ductless glands. It would be possible to make people choleric or timid, strongly or weakly sexed, and so on, as may be desired. Differences of emotional disposition seem to be chiefly due to the secretions of the ductless glands, and therefore controllable by injections or by increasing or diminishing the secretions. Assuming an oligarchic organization of society, the state could give to the children of holders of power the disposition required for command, and to the children of the proletariat the disposition required for obedience. Against the injections of the state physicians, the most eloquent socialist oratory would be powerless. The only difficulty would be to combine this submissiveness with the necessary ferocity against external enemies. But I do not doubt that official science would be equal to the task. It is not necessary, when we are considering political consequences, to pin our faith on the particular theories of the ductless glands, which may blow over like other theories. All that is essential in our hypothesis is the belief that physiology will in time find ways of controlling emotion, which it is scarcely possible to doubt. When that day comes, we shall have the emotions desired by our rulers, and the chief business of elementary education will be to produce the desired disposition, no longer by punishment or moral precept, but by the far surer method of injection or diet. The men who administer the system will have a power beyond the dreams of the Jesuits, but there is no reason to suppose that they will have more sense than the men who control education today. Technical scientific knowledge does not make men sensible in their aims, and administrators in the future will be presumably no less stupid and no less prejudiced than they are at present. So I'm sure that was probably very eerie to you and how relevant that was to today. And I want you to keep thinking about this because it's unfortunate that our culture has been so bashed down that people like Shakespeare or Schiller or listening to Mozart, Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, that our culture is so bashed that because we don't have, most people don't access them, that their thinking has been so corrupted. That the natural state of the human mind actually is to be creative. And by what Bertrand Russell was discussing, that they have injected a very specific way of thinking, through various methods. I'm sure you can think of, people's cell phones and all different kinds of addictive behavior that people have now, to self-sabotage, that people can self-sabotage their own thinking in being able to act upon the world and to do what's necessary. And this is why Mr. LaRouche really emphasized the importance of classical composition, aesthetical education, understanding the science of your own mind, how your mind works, because it's through that you're actually able to see through a lot of the evil doings of other people and to control yourself, especially emotionally. When somebody gets your goat, you can lose it. And I actually want to take a quote from, it's very short, from King Lear. I don't know if many people here are familiar with King Lear, the Shakespeare play, but right in the beginning, there's a whole scene that's painted, and towards the end of the first scene, you have Edmund, who is a bastard child of the Duke of Gloucester, and he has been conspiring to take the land away from his brother and his father. And he's convinced his father, who thinks that, I love my bastard son, and you're telling me that my other son is trying to kill me and take everything away, and he believes him right away. And Edmund, after speaking with his brother, who he's setting up, his brother's name is Edgar, setting him up to be tricked in this whole matter, he says to himself, "A credulous father, and a brother noble, whose nature is so far from doing harms that he suspects none, on whose foolish honesty my practices ride easy. I see the business. Let me, if not by birth, have lands by wit. All with me's meet, and I can fashion fit." And I want to close with that idea, and to keep that in mind, because that's what we do as an organization. That's what we do when we go into the campuses. We're not just getting out information and telling the truth and getting out, the right things, but we have to expose the way of thinking in these evil people and bring up our own people to understand how to use their own mind. So I'll leave it with that and open it up for Diane.
Yes, Diane, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I think that is very good. I just have one very short thought, because lest you think that Bertrand Russell merely had these very evil policy agendas, which you heard, there's also a method of thinking, and Lyndon LaRouche really dated the turning point of the destruction of science and scientific method with Bertrand Russell's linear deductive approach. He believed that that language itself could be reduced to mathematical formulae. And I just want to share the very beginning of one of my favorite poems by Shelley, which is nothing but contradictions. And Bertrand Russell, I suppose, would say that it's completely nonsense, but I think you will discover that even though if you had to explain it, you couldn't, there is an idea that's conjured up in your mind, and if you just think for a minute of what is said, everything contradicts, and I'm just going to do the beginning. It's To a Skylark by Percy Shelley. Hail to thee, blithe spirit, bird thou never wert, that from heaven or near it pourest thy full heart in profuse strains of unpremeditated art. Higher still and higher from the earth thou springest, like a cloud of fire, the blue deep thou wingest, and singing still dost soar, and soaring ever singest. In the golden lightning of the sunken sun, o'er which clouds are brightening, thou dost float and run like an unbodied joy whose race is just begun. And you can look at everything in here is a complete contradiction. He calls it "Oh, to a Skylark." Then he says, "Bird thou never wert." Then he says, "Higher still from the earth thou springest like a cloud of fire." A cloud and fire. Golden lightning of the sunken sun. The sun is sunken. Where's the light? Over which clouds are brightening. And he talks about the action of the thing thou dost float and run like an unbodied joy. How can something float and run which has no body? And yet there is a meaning conveyed in these words, which are completely contradictory. If you were to take a Bertrand Russellian, that's what you want to call it, approach, which is above, there's higher truth. And this is, I think, one of the things that's so destroyed our ability to communicate with one another, that we've been reduced, especially with the distancing of the pandemic and lack of human contact, but it's already been a cultural onslaught, that our communications are mediated through tweets and texts and Facebook posts, which are siphoned so that you only ever see the things that you agree with, and there's no contradiction, and suddenly the world becomes very flat. And it's very hard to break out and have an independent thought of your own. And we've lost a great deal of that, and I think it's super important, as Anastasia was saying, that the question of music, of poetry, of classical drama, that we have to really immerse ourselves in these things to regain a quality of creativity which is necessary for us to take advantage of the incredible moment that we're in.
All right. Well, so we've opened up the queue, and we'd ask people if you want to press *6 to get in there with any questions or any comments that you may have. And as we're doing that, Diane, could you say something about some of the upcoming events that are going to be happening in February in terms of, the things that Helga and others are planning?
Well, I can say that with this two extreme situations, the danger of a nuclear war with Russia, which is clearly being provoked by the global Britain and lackeys in the U.S., and Putin's response has been extremely reasonable and moderate. And Ukraine is saying, at least Zelensky is saying, he doesn't think Russia is about to invade and there's no emergency and people should calm down. But Putin said this is about the economy, it's about the destruction of Russia's economy, and the way these people think, because the transatlantic system is melting down, that you have to bludgeon everyone else and destroy them, as opposed to thinking how we can solve this. You have that, and you have the horrific situation in Afghanistan, where a German UNICEF visitor reported that there are 7 million children starving to death, 1 million of whom are so severely malnourished that if they were in Germany, they would be in an intensive care unit now. And Helga's brilliant insight with her Operation Ibn Sina, that Afghanistan is the place where the U.S., Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, Turkmenistan, all of these nations really have a common interest, which is that the country be stabilized and prosperous and not fall into complete disarray where the $80 billion of U.S. weapons fall into the hands of newly created terrorists, and you have drug-running terrorists flooding from there all over the planet. That there is a great compelling reason for our nations to put aside their differences and collaborate here, which is a brilliant insight. And the name Ibn Sina, of a great thinker born in that region, I guess about 1,100 years ago or 1,200 years ago or so, 1,300 years ago, who really was the father of modern medicine in many ways, so named after him. So there is an upcoming one event that is being co-sponsored, which is not a public event, but a seminar with the Schiller Institute and a very major Russian think tank. And then following that, there will be a public event of the Schiller Institute, probably on the 19th of February, to further the breakthroughs of that. I also just want to say for people on the call, and I guess we'll come to it, on this Saturday, Code Pink is sponsoring anti-nuclear war demonstrations all over the country, and people should look for these things and get out to them. And then tomorrow night, I should say, on the Sare for Senate Friday symposium, we're going to have a wonderful symposium on the Chinese New Year with special guests discussing the actual historic relationship between the U.S. and China.